Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's speaker series. My name is Zoe, and I am the curator for the Town of York Historical Society and Toronto's first post office. Tonight, we're doing things a little bit differently. Normally, I bring in a guest speaker, but I thought after months of doing this, it might be time for me to actually talk to you about some of my expertise at our museum. So tonight, our presentation is the Royal Mail from York. So, the Royal Mail from York. It's difficult for our 21st century selves to contemplate with our cell phones, email, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Zoom, WebEx in this case. It's difficult for us to contemplate a time when handwriting was the only means of sending a thought any distance. When Toronto was incorporated as a city in 1834, it was already a bustling capital of just over 9,000 inhabitants, most of whom were recent immigrants who had left family and friends across borders and across oceans. But the new city was remote and isolated. And if these residents wanted to communicate further than shouting distance, there was only one way to do it. And of course, that was by putting it in writing. And boy, was there much to write about during this period. In 1793, when Lieutenant Governor John Gray Simcoe and his wife Elizabeth landed in the settlement of Toronto, which then in 1793 had a population of about 200, the entire population of Upper Canada was only 21,000 settlers. So when they arrived, small colony. Simcoe renamed Toronto immediately upon his arrival, and he renamed it Toronto to York after the Grand Old Duke of York. And he made it the capital of Upper Canada, and eventually, actually quite quickly, the new town of York began booming. Its harbor off Lake Ontario and access to the interior of the province via Yonge Street made York the center of trade and commerce. More and more people came to live in this once isolated corner of the globe. By 1834, and with a population of just under 10,000, it was the largest settlement in all of Upper Canada, having just surpassed its greatest rival, Kingston, in 1832. So it was now the largest settlement in Upper Canada. And in 1834, on March 6th, the town of York would become the first city in Upper Canada, and it would then be renamed Toronto. And here in this image, we can see the celebrations of March 6th, the incorporation of Toronto. So it was winter, and people are out celebrating with bonfires and fun big events. Now, with the incorporation of Toronto, we began seeing fine brick buildings rising all over the city, both commercial, institutional, and religious buildings. The architecture at the time is what they called opulently conservative, something which makes quite the statement of Toronto's great expectations for itself. In this picture, it is worth noting that the artist, the lithograph, took a little bit of creative license. The steeple on St. James Church, which we see in the back, wouldn't actually be built until 1845. And the cupola on the top of City Hall, again, artistic license, it was not there at this time. A lot of private money was being invested in Toronto. The roads were very wide in expectation of commerce, traffic, and prosperity, but they were still unpaved and muddy. Promised municipal upgrades were slow in coming, and there was growing unhappiness and impatience with the colonial rule. Toronto's first mayor and the rabble-rousing publisher, William Lyon Mackenzie, knew this better than most and had inventoried the complaints extensively in his newspapers. The importance of the Postmaster of Toronto grew and grew along with the population of the town. He held a monopoly on all official communication, including all newspapers. But despite the financial rewards that could come with such power, Toronto's early postmasters and early post offices struggled. So let's travel back in time again, a little bit earlier, back to the founding of York, and talk about the first post office. The first post office established in York was in 1798, and it was established to ease the isolation of this tiny town. At that time, the town had no roads to connect it to neighboring communities, only a lake, which was frozen for much of the year. The first postmaster of York, William Wilcox, is all but forgotten. His office was established to help ease the isolation of the town. which had about 400 inhabitants, which were cut off by road and by ship because, again, the lake was frozen for much of the year. Wilcox served for only 3 years until 1801 and announced his resignation in the UC Gazette, so the Upper Canadian Gazette, explaining that he could not cover expenses for his office, candles, stationery, rent, and his servants. So, first postmaster couldn't afford being postmaster. His position was then taken over by William Allen, who was a young entrepreneur who took over and became York's second postmaster. He found the venture a little bit more successful. In fact, he found it very much more successful and served from 1801 to 1806, decided it wasn't for him, took a break, and then returned to it again from 1808 to 1828. There was a postmaster in between his two terms, and that was Donald McLean, of whom very little is known, unfortunately. Here we see the very first, pictured here, we see the very first post office at Frederick and King Street. Now, this building no longer stands. It was on the corner of Frederick and King. It was built in 1816 and lasted until 1828. I know that I just said, and you might be confused, I know that I just said that there were postmasters earlier, but they were operating out of rented premises, and most often there wasn't a solo post office building. There would be a postal counter next to the customs counter or next to the bank counter. So the very first post office in York was this one pictured here. Let's talk a little bit about William Allen. Allen was an interesting figure, one who seemed to be involved in every commercial venture at the time. In William Lyon Mackenzie's newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, Mackenzie described the experience of an American visitor to York. And I'm quoting here. On his arrival, the American enters the customs house and encounters the collector, William Allen. He then proceeds to mail a letter and discovers that the postmaster is none other than William Allen. He next enters the Bank of Upper Canada and once more runs into William Allen. Later, he accompanies a friend who wants a tavern license and again meets Allen in his role as inspector of licenses. On the way home, they pass a militia muster headed by the same individual. Several more improbable meetings occur, one with the treasurer of the Society for Strangers in Distress, another with a hospital trustee, and finally with the treasurer of the home district, all William Allen. The traveler completes his visit by consoling his friend, who had been informed that the commissioner for war losses had cut off half his claim. Of course, this commissioner is Mr. William Allen. So, a busy man indeed. No wonder that William Lyon Mackenzie considered Allen the head of the family compact, the elite group of Torontonians who held on to power in a nepotistic grip. However, Allen did have an assistant in the post office, and some of you who are familiar with Toronto's first post office might recognize this guy here. Here we have James Scott Howard, who was an Irish Huguenot who had arrived in York in 1819 by way of Fredericton, where he had married the daughter of one of the most important families, the Macleans. This marriage probably put him in good standing in class-conscious York. In 1928, he took over from Allen as postmaster. York, as the province's capital, was a very important post office, and the postmaster for York was also unofficially the Deputy Postmaster General of Upper Canada. Now, this next part gets a little bit confusing, so I will do my best to slow down and explain it with as much detail as I can. Let me explain this further. Before the War of American Succession, the Deputy Postmaster General of British North America was Benjamin Franklin. Of course, after the war, when the Royal Mail retreated north of the border, Thomas Stainer then became Deputy Postmaster General of British North America, and Thomas Stainer was centered out of Quebec City. Next in line, so there was the Deputy Postmaster General of British North America. Next in line would be the Deputy Postmaster General of Upper Canada. And this was the role that was given to James Scott Howard. And it was a very substantial position and very highly paid. Howard's salary in 1828 was a substantial 713 pounds per year, and this salary grew annually. To put that in context, our old friend Mackenzie, who is the mayor, only received 250 pounds per year. And even Mackenzie thought that was extravagant. So imagine how much money James Scott Howard was making. Howard was at the helm during Toronto's greatest population boom and the subsequent postal boom that accompanied it. During the 1830s, the population of Toronto increased fivefold. And that's a period of growth that is unique to its entire history. It's never been matched. To keep up with this increasing population, Howard had to change post office locations 3 times to keep up with the new volume of mail. This here that is depicted here is the first of James Scott Howard's post office, the second post office in the town of York. And this post office was located on Duke Street, now Adelaide Street, between Jarvis and George. Again, this post office no longer stands. You will no longer be able to find it. This one was also a rented building, but it was a purpose building. So the entire building was devoted to the post office, and it was a log cabin. Within a year, this post office that James Scott Howard just had wasn't big enough, and he needed more room. So he then had this home slash office built on the west side of George Street, between Adelaide and King Street, so half a block away. By 1832, however, the mail required still more room and had to move again. This time, James Scott Howard, fed up with moving, decided to erect a building that reflected the importance of the office. So, in the spring of 1833, Howard purchased for £500 an uncleared lot which had formerly been part of Judge Campbell's estate and was beside his large house at the top of Frederick Street. Many of you might now recognize this building as Campbell House, Campbell House Museum, which now stands on the corner of Queen and University. The house was moved in the 1980s, yeah, quite recently. It was moved to its current location in the 1980s, but it was initially Judge Campbell's house, and it stood, as I mentioned, at the top of Frederick Street on Duke on Adelaide, where right where the George Brown Culinary Building now is, if you're familiar with that. And Judge Campbell, many articles say Judge Campbell had the best view in the entire city because from the top of his house, looking down Frederick Street, he could see every ship coming into the harbor. Of course, our waterfront has since changed. You cannot see the water at all from the top of Frederick anymore. But back then, it was a very desirable lot. And this is the location that Howard purchased the land to build the post office from. Campbell had also sold the property next to his home to the Bank of Upper Canada. So he sold part of his estate, the lot, to the post office, and the lot next to that, he then sold to the Bank of Upper Canada, which is the building on the corner here. The Bank of Upper Canada was a company which held nearly all of Upper Canada's gold, both governmental as well as private capital. It was said that during the rebellion of 1837, Mackenzie's aim was their basement vault, where he could secure the gold needed to contract aid from American soldiers. This is a later picture, of course, and you can see here that the lot between the bank and the post office has been filled with the De La Salle Institute for Boys. But you can still see the conservative exterior, which the bank architects tried to project to its investors. The building still stands at the corner of George and Adelaide Street, and the De La Salle building, then the post office, and finally George Brown College to the east. So, just to give you an idea, this was the posh neighborhood in which Howard was building his post office. You have the judge's house on one side, you have the Bank of Upper Canada on the other. Couldn't be much better than that. But those around Howard still had their suspicions. Because you see, Howard was a Methodist. And not only that, but he was an Irish Methodist. In a town where almost anybody with any power was sure to be Anglican, it was almost unthinkable that a Methodist would be granted such a position. After all, in the year that Howard arrived in Toronto, a Methodist minister was exiled from the country for 14 years after daring to perform a marriage ceremony, a rite which was normally reserved to only the sects recognized by the Anglican government. The fact that Howard was given the job at all probably points to his wife's influence. As I mentioned previously, he married Salome McLean of the McLean family. Or maybe people didn't know about his religion when he was hired by William Allen. We don't know exactly for sure, but it was very rare for a Methodist to get such a powerful position. In any case, when Howard bought the land, the rather doubtful sounding manager of the Bank of Upper Canada, again presided by William Allen, wrote to Howard, and here I quote again, and he does sound doubtful. I am directed to say that they have consented to sell you the said 60 feet, commencing from the corner of the lot next to Sir William Campbell's, for the sum of £500. This bargain is made with the full understanding and perfect confidence of your erecting a reputable brick building, such as the president stated he had seen a plan of at your house, and that it was your intention to erect. And also with the confidence that the post office establishment is to be kept in it. So I'm not sure what he thought exactly Howard wanted to build, but no, Howard actually did have in mind a post office, and indeed he built a reputable building as planned, as pictured here. This was to be his home as well as his post office, and he employed 6 assistants. Uh, this post office may be familiar to many of you who reside in Toronto, and it is because it, of course, still stands. Um, it is now known as Toronto's first post office. It is, in fact, the town of York's fourth post office. But when the city incorporated in 1834, this was the first post office, first and only post office in the city of Toronto. It looks a little bit different these days, but not too much different. They've added a mansard roof, which was an 1880s addition. But other than that, it's of course recognizable. And Toronto's first post office still operates as a post office and it's a museum. So you're always welcome to go in and see some of the things that I'm talking about in the next slides in person. The post office in 1834 was open 11 hours a day from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. from Monday to Saturday, and for 1 hour on Sundays. For what? Yes, you've guessed it, for the convenience of those coming into town for church services. Newspaper publisher and the mayor, William Lyon Mackenzie, had his own postal box, as did the fiery young Egerton Ryerson, who would later on go to reform the school system in Upper Canada. Howard had 204 private boxes for those such as Mackenzie and Ryerson, and others at the head of the government, business, the bank, clergy, as well as the local indigenous bands for rent. So he had 204 postal boxes, as depicted in this image here, for rent. Everyone else who did not have a postal box was filed alphabetically for general delivery. And again, for those of you who have visited Toronto's first post office, you have definitely noticed these postal boxes. They are hard to miss, and they are reproduction boxes, but they are built according to original invoices and sketches from James Scott Howard himself. So they're built exactly to his dimensions. As the post office was probably the scene of much informal socializing, and as one of the duties of the postmaster was to read and write mail for those who did not know how, because the literacy rate was so low, it was 1 in 30 in 1834 in Toronto. It's probably safe to say that Howard knew everyone's business. So in the 1830s, it was key that the postmaster and his staff knew how to keep their mouths shut. But as we've heard, he did not have everyone's confidence. The Anglican Archdeacon John Strawn wrote to a friend, "The postmaster here is a Methodist in whom I have no sense of confidence. I am unwilling at times to show him who I correspond. This puts me sometimes to inconvenience." But little could be done about this. The new premises included a reading room complete with a fireplace and equipped with tables and chairs at which patrons could read their mail and compose letters in response, or have staff help them if they were illiterate. Such hasty replies were required in the 1830s, both because of the length of time for delivery. A letter to England might take 3 months to arrive to its destination, and more notably because of what an inconvenience a trip to the post office was. So unless you lived right in town, your journey to and fro the post office could be a full work day that you had to take off. So you would try to minimize your trips down to the post office by replying right away. It's important to remember that there was no home delivery yet. So you had to go into the post office to pick up your mail, which meant that on a quarterly basis, Howard was required to publish in the local press a list of people who had mail awaiting pickup. Such a list would look like this. Um, so let's say you lived in what was then Parkdale, not yet part of York. It was a small township of Parkdale. You would have to come down to the post office, no roads. It could take you 3 hours to get there, 3 hours back. You're not going to be checking every day to see if you have mail waiting for you. Rather, you would wait for this quarterly list to be published. And if you saw your name, let's say Terrence O'Neill, and you were Terrence O'Neill, you knew it was time to go to the post office, make the journey, take a seat in the reading room, pen your response, and you probably wouldn't have to do it for another few months after that. Getting mail for most, as I mentioned, was not a daily occurrence. Getting a notice of mail would probably be quite terrifying, if not exciting. What news would require the breaking of a long silence and the expense of postage? Was it good news? Sometimes, sometimes not. It was always a little bit scary to get that notice. Back at the establishment of the post office in York, with all conditions being favorable, mail would arrive once every winter by coach from Montreal. In spring and summer, service was more frequent, usually about once a month. By 1815, a weekly schedule from Montreal had the stage running through York en route to Niagara. Along the line of delivery, each postmaster would close their post office, dump the sack out, and remove all the letters addressed to his office, then parcel up the rest along with any new letters going out with paper, string, and wax to be sent to the next destination. It seems like a bit of an inefficient process, but post office regulations in the 1840s stipulated that the time occupied in exchanging this mail at each office en route is understood to be no more than 8 minutes. So if it was in fact 8 minutes, not so bad. Lock up the post office, 8 minutes, exchange the mail, then you can reopen and people come in to pick up their mail. However, satirical cartoons at the time lead us to believe that this was not always the case. This image here, by the way, is Toronto's sixth post office. So in 1845, and this was the last post office to be run by the colonial system. And you can see the satirical cartoon people quite frustrated with the waiting on the mail to be sorted. Before the railway arrived in the 1850s, mail couriers in the province's interior would travel by horse stagecoach, or they would simply walk the long distances between communities. James Morris, who would go on to become the first Postmaster General of Canada, recalled that in 1809, a traveler passed the door of my mother's residence once a fortnight, usually on foot and not infrequently crippled from walking. On his shoulder, this man carried a pair of saddlebags and altogether had the appearance of a pilgrim going to some shrine, more than a courier. Yet he was the postman between Montreal and Kingston. And in those saddlebags, that way-worn traveler carried the whole of the mail matter for Upper Canada. The physical challenges of such long treks, including the harsh climate and poor road conditions, often made these journeys treacherous and very slow. One mail courier in the 1830s came to the following tragic end. He lost his way. The snow was 2 feet deep and there were no roads. A search party found him on the third day, lying on some boughs behind a big oak log, his hands and feet frozen solid, his dog wrapped in the breast of his coat to keep him warm. Tragic. Roads in and around Toronto, when they would finally be built, were notoriously poor and waterlogged for 3 seasons of the year. Here's an old joke frequently repeated in newspapers of the time that goes like this. Are you ready for this? A man spies a top hat in the road. Yeah, I think it's funny. And so correspondents did not always trust the Royal Mail to succeed against such difficulties as coaches becoming mired in mud, tipping over on poorly maintained log roads, or falling through ice on frozen rivers. The letters would also have to contend with storms and wars at seas, robberies, creative spelling of names, and a newly mobile world population. Though people had very little choice but to communicate through paper, it was face to face, where by paper you had no other choice. Many often preferred to send their mail collect. Prepaying for a letter's journey was seen as optimistic and foolhardy. Before stamps came to Canada in 1851, the postmaster would write the cost of postage by hand on the upper right hand corner of the letter. The necessary postage for mail sent collect would be marked in black. Recipients also had to pay for the second part of a cross border trip, no option, as countries did not yet have agreements for handling each other's mail. William Lyon Mackenzie had a lot to say about the postal system, and he took issue particularly with the practice of sending mail collect. If you did choose to pay for your own letter before mailing, so if you chose to pay upon sending instead of upon receipt, the postmaster would mark the amount paid in red. So in the last letter, you notice it was black. Here we see the 7 marked in red. If you sent the mail out of the country, you were required to pay for the postage to the border or to the ship that would take it to sea. Postmasters in Upper Canada were responsible for their own premises and other capital costs. That meant operating expenses such as salaries, fuel, candles, and stationery were deducted from the amounts submitted quarterly to Thomas Stainer, the Postmaster General for British North America. Stainer provided the necessary forms, notices, and cancellation stamps, but the other materials were to the discretion of the postmaster. The red ink used in York, Toronto was distinctive in Upper Canada. Howard wrote to Stainer in 1829, I would be glad if it would be possible to get some of the red stuff, which they use in Montreal for stamping the letters. For at present, I have nothing but printer's ink, black, and it is such a greasy, dirty thing that I would like to be rid of it. The cancel includes the date of origin of the letter, as it does today. This letter originated in the 18th century, no, in the 19th century, and was the result of complaints about delays in the mail. Howard would hand stamp or personally marked letters that pass his desk. Here he has the stamp that says paid, indicating that a letter has been paid for in advance, essentially serving the same purpose as today's postal stamp, like a regular stamp. This mark is combined with the postage rate written in manuscripts. This cover is also marked too late, meaning that the letter came to the post office after the mailbag was sealed and ready to go. In that case, a supplementary bag was made up and sent along with the regular mail, all for an extra fee, of course. Correspondence relating to the post office or postal business could be sent for free. At various times, postmasters, members of parliament, government departments, and some officials could send mail for free, despite Stainer's grumblings about lost revenue and potential abuses. Money letters were the precursor of registered letters. Any letter appearing to contain money would be marked as such, and it was treated with extra care. But it would also be charged double the postage. However, until registered letters were introduced in 1841, no receipts were given to the sender and no compensation was offered if a money letter was lost. So you would pay the double postage with no actual guarantee, except that, yes, we promise extra care will be taken. So, all in all, letters could be quite marked up by the time they arrived. Take a look at that one. You have your cancellations, you have your franking, you have your postage rates, you have your paid stamps. It's very hard to decipher. But nonetheless, writing letters was the important lifeline between family members and friends across continents and oceans. People in Toronto often asked their loved ones to write soon and write often, and would complain bitterly when they didn't get news from home. One writer pleads, "I must beg and entreat that you will at least write to me 4 times a year, for to hear of your welfare is one of the greatest comforts of my life." Apart from the odd form letter from the bank, these letters, both personal and business, were handwritten. The ink use on these letters would be made at home, but would usually be purchased from chemists or street vendors. It came in a glass or stoneware bottle and was normally decanted into smaller decorative inkwells, or often in a small, cheaply made pot, often called penny inks because they cost a penny. Penny inks would be discarded when empty. They, along with clay pipes, were among the only disposables of 19th century life. If you did wish to make your ink at home, many common recipes use soot collected from lamp chimneys plus water plus resin, which would adhere the pigment to the page. Or at our museum, Toronto's first post office, we use black walnut ink, which is what James Scott Howard used, and we still use his recipe, which uses black walnut husk, water, and gum arabic to help bind the pigment to the paper. Along with ink, one also needed ponce. This was a mixture of absorbent materials such as sand, powdered chalk, and cuttlefish bone. It was sprinkled onto the paper to absorb any excess ink, and it would then be poured back into the sander and reused. So this was pre-blotting paper. Ponce is what was used to quicken the drying process. Again, before whiteout existed, mistakes could still be erased. And they would be erased very carefully using an instrument called an eraser knife. That is the blade portrayed in this image at the very front. Using this eraser knife, you would be able to scrape away ink from the top of your page and then repolish that page smooth with a stone. So you were literally just removing some of the particles of paper. So you were thinning your paper out so you could rewrite on top of it. You couldn't do it too much or you would poke a hole through your letter. And in the 1830s, steel nib pens were soon to replace the quills, which had been used for over 1,000 years. But when the people of Toronto sat down in Howard's reading room, they would still have been using quills made out of feathers of a goose. Quill pens could be cut at home or bought ready to go, but they would soon have to be replaced or recut. Careful clerks who did nothing but write could usually make a quill last about a week. Here we see 5 quills in a communal inkwell, and they all had their own holes where they could dry in between uses. You also see a penknife and a quill cutter, which is used almost like a nail clipper would be used now, but you would use that at the tip of your quill to cut a nice tip into it. Next, I would like to talk a little bit about paper. Here we have a letter from a young lady named Henrietta who writes to her brother in England. She has cross-written this letter to save on the cost of paper. Early on, paper was a rarity in Toronto. The first paper mill was established in York in 1826 in response to a demand by William Lyon Mackenzie that the government fund a contest. The paper at Eastwood and Skinner's Mill at Todmorden was cotton rag based, which is much more costly than our wood pulp paper now. And if you ever find yourself at Todmorden's Mill, which is a city-run historic site, they do still have some interpretation about the early paper mill there. So paper in Toronto and in much of the colonies was cotton based because of international shipping and the cotton pulp industry. And it was just much easier to manufacture than wood pulp. Postage was also very costly and based on the number of sheets used. So Henrietta is being very thrifty by filling her one piece of paper twice. We can see this quite often, this cross-written letter, or also we see correspondence replying to a letter on the same original paper. And cross-writing literally just means You take one sheet of paper, you write your letter. When you run out of space, instead of using a second sheet of paper, you literally just take your paper, turn it 90 degrees, and keep writing in the opposite direction. So you're writing in a cross hatch pattern. And it was very common at this time. This again, same letter, but on the back of Henrietta's letter, we can see at the very end that her lines are getting smaller and smaller and closer together. And in fact, the very last thing she says here is, I must conclude now, as my paper won't hold anymore. Henrietta's handwriting here is sometimes difficult to decipher, especially when she tries to save on paper, but her writing really is quite beautiful. At a time when only 1 in 30 people were literate, those who were lucky enough to learn their letters were taught to a certain standard. Again, to save on the cost of paper, once you would finish writing your letter, you would then fold that letter up into the shape of an envelope and you would seal it with wax. So you wouldn't use a secondary piece of paper to put your letter in because that you're using more paper and it adds the weight to and it adds to the weight of your letter. So you would take this letter, fold it up, and transform it into its own envelope to save on the cost of postage and on the cost of paper. Of course, you don't want it opening up in the mail. So when the letter was completed, dried, and folded, it would then be sealed with wax, melted onto the paper, and pressed down hard using a seal. Sealing wax hardens very quickly, so an image on the wax press, the image of a seal pressed into a wax could send a message in and of itself. Business seals often left a logo or a plain crosshatch pattern. Personal seals, such as James Scott's Howard, which is the one pictured here, might imprint a coat of arms, a bust, initials, or perhaps a motto. Some seals were made of heavy wood or metal and were meant to be used at a writing desk. Others were carved into glass or a jewel and would be worn as rings, signet rings, or perhaps on a watch chain. Early in the 19th century, wax was usually red. If it was not red, it would be black, and black was usually reserved for mourning. So that was a little bit about communication instruments. Going back to the politics and the larger political movements influencing the postal system at the time, I have mentioned this gentleman before. This is Toronto's first mayor, William Lyon Mackenzie. And Mackenzie, as a newspaper publisher, often relied on the Royal Mail to deliver his newspapers, but he also often denounced it. He claimed it was overpriced, profiting hugely, and he would also denounce the fact that all the profits made from the Royal Mail were sent directly back to England rather than invested back into its upper Canadian operations. Improvements would come slowly in colonial Canada, and the post office was no exception. 40 years after the establishment of the post office in Upper Canada, many populous areas still had no mail at all. Even for those that did, communication would take a very long time. So the length of sending your mail took a very long time. For example, in 1837, the people of Toronto learned that Queen Victoria had ascended to the throne 43 days after the event had taken place. Delays and disasters were sadly understood and accepted, but the tariffs set by the British postal system made sending letters almost prohibitive to all but the very wealthy and to the government officials. For example, a letter from Toronto to Niagara cost sixpence. It's not a very large distance, sixpence. Sixpence was as much as 2 dozen eggs. A letter to England would be more than a laborer could make in an entire day, and rates would then double if you added a second sheet of paper and tripled for 3 sheets. The colonists found their own solution to the many dangers and expenses that faced letters in the Royal Mail. The strange fact is that it seems, based on documents I've read and a lot of primary source research, that about 90% of all mail sent in the early part of this country's history were sent outside of the actual system. So they weren't actually sent through the Royal Mail. Instead, they were sent as something called favor letters. Travelers, ship captains, and soldiers would carry letters from others as a matter of course, being paid a little something for their trouble. John Askin wrote to his son in 1811, I have got this letter for you already for the first person who calls and is going your way. So often, travelers, which would be captain soldiers or preachers, often people who would move communities a lot, would be given a few extra pence, a few extra shillings to carry this letter to its destination as a favor for someone. As postmaster, Howard enjoyed free post with his franking privileges on both business and personal mail, but franking privileges for postmasters were eventually withdrawn in 1844 due to frequent abuses. Numerous memos issued by the Postmaster General Stainer confirmed that the mail was often tampered with, even by those within the system themselves. In 1834, Stainer found himself compelled to announce that some unprincipled person in a post office has abused his trust and violated his oath by abstracting from the mail packets that property which the public confidence has entrusted to the safekeeping of the department. That's a very long and convoluted quote just to say that a post office employee tampered with the content of a letter, and it sounds like possibly pocketed some of the money contained in it. In an advertisement published in the Patriot the next year, Stainer later offers a helpful hint for the security of money letters, suggesting, and I love this suggestion, where he suggested cutting banknotes in half and only forwarding the second piece when receipt of the first had been confirmed. For important news, people tried to thwart the risks of the system and would send multiple copies of the same letter by different means in hopes that one would arrive. Some frequent correspondents numbered their letters at the bottom and kept a record of those both sent and received. So you would have a correspondence journal where you would number your correspondence. Robberies were also a problem at this time. Before checking accounts, Western Union, and electronic banking, it was often necessary for both businesses and individuals to send cash through the mail. As this was often carried through the wilderness on the back of one man, security was constantly on the minds of the mail couriers, their customers, and potential thieves. And believe it or not that many people took Stainer up on his offer to cut bills in half. Robbery of the mail was taken very seriously, and as time went on, couriers often traveled in pairs and went out carrying weapons. By 1837, Toronto was receiving a post from England almost every day. So, again, we can see how quickly the postal system is expanding here in Upper Canada. Correspondence to and from the government, the bank, clergy, merchants was all handled by Howard and his 6 assistants. Together, they processed the largest volume of mail in all of Upper Canada. And that is out of that tiny little post office at 260 Adelaide Street. As a public official, James Scott Howard considered it a very important that he remain politically neutral. He did not vote in elections, nor did he attend political meetings. In 1837, when rumors came of an armed rebellion forming outside the city, an armed guard of volunteers was formed. Howard refused to join, citing his neutrality. When the rebellion broke, Howard was joined at work by Charles Albert Bursey, who had recently become the first post office surveyor of Upper Canada when Howard refused the post. The two men spent the few days of the rebellion sleeping in the post office because, God forbid, someone comes in and steals all the correspondence for Upper Canada. So the two men spent the rebellion sleeping in the post office. Bursey spent the days going through the mail looking for anything suspicious. Howard refused to help him in his task, but when a letter came addressed to Howard, but containing a letter addressed to a friend of Mackenzie, he handed it over to Bursey. And this is actually what was to be Howard's downfall. Within days, Howard was removed from his office. No formal charges were ever laid, but the family compact had closed its ranks, and Howard was dismissed and outside of the circle. Uh, Bursey would take over the post office of York. So after Howard's dismissal, same Bursey would take over as postmaster, and he would also retain his role as surveyor general as well. And he decided that the location at 260 Adelaide Street was no longer large enough, and he would move the establishment to this building on Front Street, just west of Yonge. And again, I feel like I'm a broken record, but this post office no longer stands. And then after that location, he then moved it on to Wellington Street. And this would be the last Royal Mail outlet in Toronto. In 1851, control of the post office department finally passed from England to the province of Canada. And with this reform came Canada's first postal stamp, the three-penny beaver, much more affordable than the day's wage the same letter would demand in 1850. But just let us step back once more to the very early days of the post in Canada. This letter was written by William Bursey, Charles Bursey's father, who had brought many of these settlers to Upper Canada. He wrote to his wife every single day when they were separated. The world was shifting under Bursey's feet. It was expanding into the interior of North America and shrinking as he found he could maintain contact with his loved ones wherever he was. Those of us who send letters and even emails know the emotion he is feeling when he marvels in this letter. What greater pleasure could I have when I am far from you than to take advantage of the happy and marvelous invention of transmitting thoughts on a sheet of paper over any distance imaginable? And that concludes my presentation.